Dear compatriots, greetings from Nicosia. This is the third and final lecture covering the history of modern Cyprus from 1878 to the present. This lecture will cover the effects of the Turkish invasion, the main events from 1974 to 2007, but also subsequent events bringing it to the present. Then we will proceed with a more detailed account and analysis of the attempts at a settlement of the Cyprus problem, which is really the main problem facing Cyprus and the Cypriot people these days. Then we will end with concluding remarks and some general comments about the uncertain future. This is the map of Cyprus, and as it is now, indicating the Attila line, the occupied part of Cyprus, and the main cities of the Republic. These are some scenes from the invasion, just to get started with that theme and examine subsequently the effects. These are Turkish troops arriving on the shores of Kyrenia, landing at Kyrenia, parachutists in the parallel to Pentadactylos range, mountain range, in the Messauria Valley, where the Turkish Air Force dropped parachuters. Now, we can start by saying that in spite of the troubled early years of the Republic, there was at the same time considerable economic development in all aspects of the economy. Agriculture improved. The creation of the cooperative society helped the farmers, the small farmers, who were able to make better use of their land. There was the development of light industry. Services developed considerably, and of course the main source of income began to be tourism. These developments, especially through tourism, brought about what has been described as an economic miracle. However, events gradually were to destroy these developments. The fact that now the Cypriot people, after so many years of foreign rule, were living under better conditions, events within and amongst the Greek Cypriots would have tragic consequences. On the 15th of July 1974, there was the coup against Archbishop Makarios. This was instigated by the military junta in Athens, with the support of EOKA B Cypriots, who had been organized by Grivas. This was very soon followed by the Turkish invasion, 20th to the 22nd of July, the first phase of what was known as Attila I, and then in August 14th to the 16th, the second phase of the Turkish invasion, Attila II. Now, what were the effects of the invasion. There was loss of territory of almost 37%. In these areas that are still under Turkish occupation, we have the largest part of the agricultural area, accounting for the biggest percentage of agricultural production. There was the loss of tourist attractions, the main tourist areas. For example, Famagusta, Kairinha at that time were the best tourist destinations. There were 200,000 refugees. One should note here that the population of Cyprus at the time was about 600,000. So we are really saying that the 1/3 of the population became refugees. They moved from the north to the south as the Turkish army advanced. There were 1,619 missing persons. This is a continuing tragedy, although in the last years a number of these missing persons the remains have been found, and through appropriate scientific tests they have been identified. There is still a number that has not been found, and it is still one of the tragic results and the cause of suffering for many families. It is estimated that almost 3,000 people were killed, soldiers and civilians. There was considerable destruction due to bombing. There was loss of further land, the no man's land, where the UN is in control and separates the two sides. We have seen the destruction of infrastructure of tourism. There was tremendous violation of human rights during the invasion, rape, murder, torture, and summary executions. A number of Greek Cypriots were trapped in the occupied territory, especially Carpathia, and most of these were gradually forced to move to the south. In actual fact, Turkey was implementing ethnic cleansing. The idea was to clean the northern part of Cyprus from any of the Greek Cypriots who lived in the area which they had under their control. Parallel to this, there was irreparable destruction of our cultural and religious heritage. Cemeteries, churches, monasteries, and other monuments were destroyed in an effort to erase any sign of the previous habitation of the area by Greek Cypriots. This is the military cemetery on the west of Nicosia, where there are buried young soldiers who died during the invasion, both Greeks from mainland Greece and Cypriots. Some photos of aircraft of Cyprus Airways which were destroyed on the tarmac in the old in Nicosia International Airport. They are still there to remind us of what had happened in those tragic months of the summer of 1974. The Nicosia International Airport cannot be used. It's under the control of the United Nations force in Cyprus. This is another picture of what was inside the airport. The ghost town of occupied Famagusta. This is the enclosed area of Varosha, which has been sealed off by the Turkish army, and it has been standing there, silent and mute, gradually facing the problems created by time, and all efforts over the years for the return of the lawful inhabitants of of Famagusta, of Varosha, have not had any result. This is another picture of part of this enclosed area. In the aftermath of the invasion, with 200,000 refugees, every effort was made to provide them with temporary place and basic facilities. As you can see here, one of the early refugee camps. Again, another photo showing part of a refugee camp. This, the tragedy of the missing persons, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, really desperately seeking to find information as to what had happened to their loved one. Some were soldiers, others were civilians. So, the main events after the invasion on the 22nd of July, the military junta in Greece collapsed. It had done the damage of actually, through the coup, providing Turkey with the excuse of intervening in Cyprus in order, as it claimed, to protect the Turkish Cypriots and restore constitutional order. This was the statement by the Turkish government at the time. The government, in inverted commas, of Nikos Sapson, which was established by those who had taken over control of the government, collapsed. So this only lasted for about 8 days. On the 23rd of July, Glafkos Kliridis, then leader of the House of Representatives, took over as acting president, since Makarios had managed to escape from the presidential palace, but then was flown out of the island to Malta and then London. The problems that were faced at the time were tremendous. There was the presence of Turkish troops estimated at about 40,000. The economy was ruined in the respect that I showed earlier: agriculture, light industry, tourism. There was considerable unemployment. The government, which was very quickly set up by acting President Kliridis, tried to face the more immediate problems of providing the basic needs of the refugees. The 7th of December 1974, Makarios returned to Cyprus. Negotiations for a settlement of the Cyprus problem began soon after. This is a scene of the welcome given to Archbishop Makarios on his return to Cyprus. On the 3rd of August 1977, Makarios died suddenly of a heart attack. And on the 3rd of September, Spyros Kyprianou was elected president to serve the remaining term of office of Archbishop Makarios. This is a list of the presidents of the Republic, beginning with Archbishop Makarios, Spyros Kyprianou, who was the leader and founder of Dico party, George Vasiliou, who did not belong to any political party. He was a businessman, but with the support of Agel, Dico and the DEC, won the elections in 1988. Lavkos Kliridis served 2 terms as president, to be followed by Tassos Papadopoulos, Dimitris Christofias, the leader. He was secretary of the Agel, the Communist Party, and finally Nikos Anastasiadis, that won the elections in 2013 and is now in his 2nd term of office. This is Archbishop Makarios, Spyros Kyprianou, George Vasiliou, Lavkos Kliridis, Tassos Papadopoulos, Dimitris Christofias, and Nikos Anastasiadis. The Turkish Cypriot leaders, this is Dr. Fazil Kuchuk. He was the first vice president of the Republic soon after its establishment, where as a result of the Zurich-London agreements and the subsequent constitution that was worked out, the president of the Republic was to be a Greek Cypriot and the vice president a Turkish Cypriot. Fazil Kuchuk was the leader of the Turkish Cypriots and the first elected vice president of the Republic. Then there is Rauf Denktaş, the man who actually dominated Cypriot politics. He dominated Turkish Cypriot politics, but through the events that developed, especially from 1964 onwards, one could say that he was one of the main actors in the political life of Cyprus right up to his death. Mehmet Ali Talat followed Rauf Denktaş. Mehmet Ali Talat was a moderate Turkish Cypriot politician, inclined to the left, and one would say that he worked well for a while with President Christofias, where they managed to make some progress in agreeing to a number of issues that were part of the cause of conflict between the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. This is Dervish Eroğlu, a right-winger who could be described as a right-wing extremist, and once he took over as the leader of the Turkish Cypriots, there was not much progress after some of the agreements between President Christofias and Turkish Cypriot leader Talat. And this is the current leader of the Turkish Cypriots, Mustafa Akinci, could be described as a moderate Turkish Cypriot politician. However, as in the case of Talat, anything that went beyond what Turkey desired and allowed was soon stopped. Talat, we know, lost the elections once the signal came from Ankara that they did not want him there any longer, and Mustafa Akinci is facing problems now as to his freedom of formulating Turkish Cypriot policy. We now move on to another theme, the joining of Cyprus to the European Union, that is EU accession. On the 4th of July 1990, the government of Cyprus applied for membership of the EU. This could be described as a bold move, considering the existence of the Cyprus problem, the division of the island, and the presence of Turkey in the occupied part of Cyprus. Many EU countries were reluctant to accept Cyprus because of this unsolved problem and the possible complications in the relations with Turkey. They were afraid that once Cyprus joined with the existing problem as a divided island with the presence of Turkey and Turkish troops, that this will or would take the problem within the European Union, which they would have had to deal with, and which many of them did not want to undertake because of the possibility of strained relations with Turkey. And economic interest and other interests made them apprehensive. Nevertheless, in spite of these reservations, strong support from Greece, led by Yannis Granidiotis, a high-ranking Greek diplomat of Cypriot origin, helped Cyprus's application. The Greek government threatened to block the accession of any other country if Cyprus was not admitted into the European family. It was evident that with the criteria which the European Union had adopted in terms of allowing the process of accession of any country, economic, democratic governance and so on, Cyprus had no problem with that. Adjustments were needed, but this was the case also with other countries that had joined previously. The problem with Cyprus was the Cyprus problem, the division of the island, and the political problem that existed. However, the very strong stance by Greece helped the cause of Cyprus, and Cyprus was finally accepted and joined the EU on the 1st of May 2004. With a strong and steadily developing economy, Cyprus met the criteria and joined the Eurozone on 1st January 2008. These are some of the coins once the Cyprus pound was removed, withdrawn, and the euro was adopted. This is a collection of the coins depicting scenes from Cyprus. Now, there is no doubt that the majority of the Cypriot supported joining the EU, not only for economic and financial reasons, but also for political reasons. The belief that as a member of the EU, Cyprus would enjoy the support of the European Union in relation to Turkey and the solution of the Cyprus problem was a very strong incentive for many Cypriots desiring accession to the EU. It would make them feel safer in facing any threats from Turkey. Unfortunately, so far, the Cyprus problem remains unsolved. The support offered by the EU is more moral, oral, and not practical. This is evident even in these last days, where Turkey, President Erdogan, has been taking actions that are in violation of many international laws, international moral standards, and yet the European Union limited itself to expressing sadness, expressing the wish that there will be a change in Turkish policy, but not going any further than that. Now, economic development continued in the years after 2008, but lack of proper fiscal and banking control led to the financial crisis of 2013. So the people of Cyprus were to experience another very heavy blow after the events of 1974 and the Turkish invasion. In actual fact, there was a partial sort of problem in the sense after the events of 63, late 63, beginning of 64, there was the recovery. Then came a Turkish invasion in 74, destruction again, ruined economy, recovery to the extent that Cyprus met the criteria to join the European Union and then the Eurozone, and this economic financial progress continued. But as I said, mistakes were made in the financial sector, and this brought the crisis of 2013. On the 25th of March, a bailout was imposed by the European Commission. There were strict measures imposed by the Troika. There was loss of monetary deposits over 100,000 euro. Many people saw their deposits, their savings of a lifetime disappear overnight, and this would result in very serious hardship. One of the two biggest banks, like Popular Bank, was forced to close. So there was considerable unemployment again. Businesses collapsed. People owed money which now they couldn't pay. Many people saw, as I said earlier, their savings and what they considered to be, in a way, safe deposits to spend on their children's education, for their retirement and so on, disappear. However, again, the Cypriot people, as in the years after 1974, rose to the occasion. With their known resilience and hardworking nature, they managed to put the economy back on the road to recovery. I would like to stress this characteristic of the Cypriot people. There are many, even amongst us Greek Cypriots, who see a number of our weaknesses as people sometimes were a bit unruly, sometimes not adjusting and following rules, regulations, and so on. But there is one thing that stands out, and that is the fact that the Cypriot people are very hardworking and they are resilient in trying to find ways to survive. They are survivors. They showed this not only in the recent years and the crisis that had hit the island, but even through the centuries of foreign occupation, of great variety, going back to the Egyptians, Persians, Romans, Franks, Venetians, Ottomans, yet they managed to survive and to maintain their identity as Greeks, Greek Christian, Orthodox Christians. Now, the situation was again difficult, but with sacrifices, the recovery began. Cyprus met the conditions imposed by the Troika and managed to go back on a track of economic recovery. Now, in more recent times, the discovery of natural gas deposits in Cyprus's exclusive economic zone was made around 2011. This opened up a new phase for economic recovery and prosperity. However, at the same time, it created further political complications and tensions with Turkey. Turkey, using the pretext of protecting the rights and interests of the Turkish Cypriots, intervened and questioned the right of the Republic of Cyprus for exploitation of the gas reserves. Turkey illegally entered Cyprus's exclusive economic zone and is currently proceeding with drilling. There is now increased tension in the Eastern Mediterranean as a result of Turkey's activities and actions, trying to establish a strong presence in the area. The European Union has expressed its support for Cyprus, but to date has not done much in any practical way to force Turkey to respect international law and cease all illegal activities. There have been some minor sanctions imposed, but even those are not strictly applied by some countries, even members of the European Union. President Erdogan so far is not responding to any of these verbal requests and is more or less ignoring whatever comes from the EU as a body, but also from individual countries, member states of the European Union, but even beyond that. At a time when the economic situation appeared to be improving, came the COVID-19 pandemic, which hit Cyprus in March 2020. As the pandemic spread, the Cyprus government introduced strict measures and a lockdown in order to control the spread of the virus. Government policies and measures were successful, and Cyprus received commendable mentions for its handling of the pandemic. The lockdown and the restrictions imposed by the pandemic have affected seriously economic activity on the island, especially the tourist industry, which is the cornerstone of the Cyprus economy. Many measures have been introduced by the government in an effort to stimulate the economy, but the future remains uncertain as long as the virus is around and no vaccine is available. Now, in the middle of what would have been the height of the tourist season, a few of the many hotels have managed to open. Even these are operating under difficult conditions, mainly relying on the local population, the Cypriots, for their vacations, a few foreign tourists, but because of the restrictions, this does not allow the arrival of large numbers. So I would like to say, for example, that the last years Cyprus had been sort of breaking records in tourist arrivals, reaching, like last year, almost 4 million tourists from different countries, which, considering the size of the island and the population, can be considered a high number. And we now move to one of the major parts of this lecture, which has to do with the attempts at the settlement of the Cyprus problem. Negotiations and attempts at the solution of what has come to be known as the Cyprus problem began under the auspices of the United Nations as far back as 1964, after the events of December 63, early January 64. Intensive negotiations were carried out in the period 1964-1974. In January 1964, a meeting was held in London on the initiative of the British government, with participants Britain, Greece, Turkey, the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. It examined the situation, the different sides put on the table their views, but at the end the meeting ended unsuccessfully. In February 1964, another proposal for a solution was rejected by the government of Cyprus as leading to the partition of the island. Here I could summarize the situation as it was on the ground. After the events of 1963-64, the Turkish Cypriots withdrew from the government, the civil service, and the House of Representatives, and there was a creation of a number of enclaves in which they were constrained. Now, the attempts now at a solution was really to find out and what was acceptable to the two sides to make the Republic of Cyprus function properly with respect to the rights of all the people of Cyprus. However, the situation that existed, especially after the events of late 63, early 64, had created fears, suspicions, and animosity between the two sides. Further, there was the presence of the guarantor powers, Britain, Greece, and Turkey, and they had a say in whatever arrangements were going to be made regarding the future of the Republic of Cyprus. A particular problem was Turkey, in that the Turkish government adopted a policy of trying to promote what the Turkish government described as the rights of the Turkish Cypriot people, but at the same time, through its proposals and control over the Turkish Cypriots, was actually trying to further its own objectives on the island and in the wider region of the Eastern Mediterranean. There was, of course, the problem also with Greece, but in a different way. The Greek government accepted the fact that the Republic of Cyprus was an independent state. Yes, they wanted the Greek element on the island. There had been support at times of this union with Greece, but the main problem regarding Greece was the presence on the island of those Greek Cypriots who still saw that as that is union with Greece as the final solution to the Cyprus problem. This, of course, was not acceptable to the Turkish Cypriots and Turkey. The Turkish Cypriots were always apprehensive and afraid that as a minority their rights would be violated and they would be dominated by the Greek Cypriots. Turkey used this as a pretext, but more importantly was to protect her interests, as I said earlier, on the island and in the wider region. And one major consideration was not to allow Greece to gain any advantage on the island. Britain, on the other hand, wanted to secure its own position as a guarantor power, which gave her the power to protect her strategic interests, which were represented in the two sovereign bases that Britain had secured through the Zurich-London agreements, the base of Tigelia and Akrodiri. We must not forget that this was the time of the Cold War. Tensions between East and West were high. NATO on one hand, Warsaw Pact on the other. The area of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean was a very sensitive area. There was the problem of Israel and Palestine, Egypt under Nasser. So the British wanted to secure that they could still use the bases and so on to promote their own geostrategic policies in the area. Behind that, there was also the US, which was worried about the possible involvement of the Soviet Union and therefore began to show an interest in a solution of the Cyprus problem in a way that would not give any advantage to the Soviet Union to get involved in the area. This trying to compromise or work through all these different objectives of all these different interests was not an easy task. At one point, there was a proposal made by the United States, which came to be known as the Acheson Plan, which was rejected by both Greeks and the Turks, even though there were two versions of it. There was the Acheson Plan 1 and there was Acheson Plan 2. For the Greek Cypriots, Archbishop Makarios did not accept it because when one studies the provisions, it would lead to a partition of the island. It provided for the first Acheson Plan for a Turkish base on the island, which would be sovereign and of indefinite duration. In Acheson Plan 2, this was modified to a lease of a base for a period of 50 years. Okay, there are many details. Some of the provisions were not acceptable to Archbishop Makarios, the Cypriot government in that respect. Some were not acceptable to the Turkish Cypriots and Turkey, and some were not acceptable to Greece. And this created a very complex situation, and is indicative of what was to follow all the decades afterwards to the present, where a solution has yet to be found. On the 26th of March 1965, Gallo Plaza, an official UN mediator, submitted his report to the UN General Secretary with hand. Now, this is a very extensive document. In many respects, Gallo Plaza put down on paper the realities of the situation and respecting certain principles concerning the rights of the majority, the rights of the minority, the rights of an independent state, made the report, in a sense, well, acceptable to the Greek Cypriots, but was very quickly rejected by the Turks as favoring the Greek side. With these documents, as a historian, I must point out that there are different views on the Greek Cypriot side, and amongst those that support, in inverted commas, the positions of the Cypriot government, and in that sense the Greek Cypriots, saw it as a very fair, well-documented report. On the other hand, the other side, Turkey, the Turkish Cypriots, and those who supported the Turkish positions, considered it to be biased, to be favorable to the Greek side, and therefore unacceptable. They summarily rejected it without even any consideration of starting, discussions and so on to see if it could be amended and so on. The situation after the invasion changed dramatically. Whereas in the period, one would say 64 to 74, the Greek side had the upper hand in that the Turkish Cypriots were in the enclaves, admittedly living under very difficult conditions with unemployment and really a number of restrictions which affected their everyday life. After 1974, the situation changed. The Greek Cypriots were in a much weaker position, and Turkey was now more than ever involved, with 40,000 troops present on the island. The Turkish army continued with ethnic cleansing in the north. There was movement of population through an agreement. I use inverted commas in that it was an agreement which was forced by circumstances and the power of Turkey more than the result of free will and free negotiations, and there was a kind of exchange of population. The remaining Greek Cypriots in the north, the largest number, with some exceptions, moved to the south, and Turkish Cypriots who lived in the south were moved to the north. There were now refugees on both sides. This would create another problem, which would be added to the negotiations, and that was the property issue, with Turkey occupying almost 37% of the island. One can understand that it meant that extensive property, whole villages, towns and so on, inhabited by Greek Cypriots and property owned by Greek Cypriots passed into the hands of Turkey and the Turkish Cypriot authorities. Now, with the movement of population, Turkish Cypriots who lived in the south were moved to property, houses, whole villages, which were Greek Cypriot. So subsequently, this was to be made even more complicated when Turkey began to adopt a policy of bringing Turks from Turkey to settle in the north. These were illegal settlers, and there are now quite a few thousand of them. Nobody really knows the exact number, but they are certainly many, many more than the Turkish Cypriots. So these have settled and taken over Greek property. So now, after years, the problem is more complicated in that there is the political aspect of it. What sort of state would be created considering the realities of after 1974, but at the same time you have the property issue, and now, so many years afterwards, the presence of these thousands of settlers from Turkey who are actually changing the demographic character of the north. And this is a big problem as to what would happen if and when a solution is found. Would they leave and go back to Turkey? Would some stay? There is the argument that now, 46 years or so after the invasion, a number of these were born in Cyprus. So on the Turkish side, there is claim that they have the same rights as any other Cypriot. And they use arguments regarding human rights, sometimes legalistic arguments, humanitarian arguments, but in the end, a solution would probably have to be a political one. Well, in April 1975, negotiations between Cleridis and Denktash began in Vienna under the auspices of UN Secretary-General Waldheim. Rounds of talks in Vienna ended inconclusively. Again, Rauf Denktash, representing what one would say the right-wing nationalistic elements amongst the Turkish Cypriots, began to present demands that were considered unacceptable by the Greek side. And, of course, he had the support of Turkey, because Denktash is seen by even a number of Turkish Cypriots as someone who saw himself more as a Turk rather than a Turkish Cypriot, and in that sense he had no problem in promoting what in effect were the interests of Turkey, which of course he considered to be the best, to be serving the best interests of the Turkish Cypriots. An important conference in Helsinki in July 1975 also ended without any progress. The Turks demanded the creation of a bizonal federation. They insisted on having under their control territory disproportional to the Turkish Cypriot population and considerable autonomy to be given to the federated states, which in reality would amount to a confederation. Here, I would like to provide some information to clarify this. A reminder that when we talk about population, we're really talking about 78% Greek Cypriots, 4% of groups like Armenians, Maronites, and Latins, who as religious minorities had, from the days of the establishment of the Republic, stated that they placed themselves on the side of the Greek Cypriots because the constitution provided for two, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. Now with those, we're talking about 82%. The Turkish Cypriots were about 18%, and a number of them had actually left for the UK, Canada, US, in the years mostly 64 to 74. Therefore, when one sees what a Turkish side wants in terms of territory, it is disproportional to the ratio of the population. Also, the way they present or explain their autonomy, which they want in practical terms, amounts really to a confederation, not a federation. In political statements, they use the term federation. But when one looks at what is actually proposed in practical terms, for anyone who understands these political terms and so on, would not find it difficult to see that they're actually thinking of a confederation. Now, what is very important is what is described as the high-level agreement between Archbishop Makarios and Rauf Dektaş in February 1977. They reached an agreement on a framework for a solution to the Cyprus problem in the presence of the UN Secretary General Waldheim. It's important to look at the phraseology, the terms of this agreement, because over the years they have been the subject of different interpretations, creating conflicts and disagreements, not only between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots as to what this agreement actually meant, but also within the Greek Cypriot side. It states, we are seeking an independent, non-aligned, bi-communal federal republic. Here, Archbishop Makarios made what was considered by many a painful compromise, in that he accepted the bi-communal federal nature of this new state that would develop out of the Republic of Cyprus as it was established with the Zurich-London agreements of 1959. The territory under the administration of each community should be discussed in the light of economic viability or productivity and land ownership. Now, this is has been the subject of different interpretations. in that what was used at the time, and those who analyzed this agreement and others that were subsequently reached. There is this thing that is often used in political science, this constructive ambiguity. So when one looks at this point number 2, the territory under the administration of each community should be discussed in the light of economic viability or productivity and land ownership. So let's look at it from a practical point of view. The Turkish Cypriot side, in giving an indication as to what they might accept, which is disproportional to the ratio of population, use economic viability and productivity. They would say that, they put emphasis on that. They would say, but if this federated state is going to survive, it needs economic viability, and it has to have more territory. On the Greek Cypriot side, there is the issue of land ownership. So if a disproportional size of territory of land is given to the Turkish Cypriots, it will raise the question of land ownership. Most of this would belong, as it is natural since they were the majority, to Greek Cypriots. Therefore, over the years, this has been the subject of different interpretations, and therefore creating problems as to what exactly could be agreed. The third point, questions of principles like freedom of movement, freedom of settlement, the right of property, and other specific matters are open for discussion, taking into consideration the fundamental basis of a bicommunal federal system and certain practical difficulties which may arise for the Turkish Cypriot community. So again, this contains elements that could lead to different interpretation. The Greek Cypriot side understands and insists over all these years on the freedom of movement, that all Cypriots could move to any part of the island, the freedom of settlement, that they could settle in any part of the island, the right of property, so this would secure the properties of both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. It says, are open for discussion, taking into consideration the fundamental basis of a bicommunal federal system and certain practical difficulties which may arise for the Greek Cypriot community. In practical terms, in some of the later negotiations, the Turkish side said, but if the Greeks are free to move and settle again wherever they want, there will be a majority in some parts, and this goes against the fundamental basis of a bicommunal federal system. On the Greek Cypriot side, however, there is emphasis on the principles, that this is what exists in all modern, civilized, democratic countries. And this goes on. The powers and functions of the central federal government will be such as to safeguard the unity of the country, having regard to the bicommunal character of the state. This is something which, to the present, the Greek side attaches considerable importance, and that is that whatever solution is found, it would create a state which is a unified state, and not a state with divided powers. And this is, again, the essence in the differences regarding a federal state and a federation and confederation. Because as you move away from the federal state towards a confederation, it means that more and more the unity of the state is affected and it's weakened. The central government loses more and more authority, which goes to the federated states. In this case, the Turkish Cypriot Federated State and the Greek Cypriot Federated State. At this point, we also noticed the involvement of U.S. President Carter to facilitate the negotiations. I would mention here again that the Cyprus problem was of concern to the U.S., a succession of U.S. governments, because of the situation I described earlier that prevailed in the Eastern Mediterranean. There was always the possibility of a conflict between Greece and Turkey resulting from Cyprus problem, and this would mean a conflict between two NATO powers. This would weaken that part of the flank of NATO, and of course provide an advantage to the Soviet Union. At the same time, there was consideration of the situation in the wider region of the Eastern Mediterranean with Israel, Egypt, and so on, and again the attempts by the Soviet Union to extend its influence in the area. The continuation of the Cyprus problem increased the danger of conflict and possible gains by the Soviet Union. Therefore, we see the involvement of the United States in these attempts to find a solution. However, not wanting to take any strong action, this involvement is more in terms of mediation and trying to influence one or the other side. On the 3rd of August, we have the death of Archbishop Makarios, who died suddenly of a heart attack. And of course, this made matters more complicated because it left a serious power vacuum amongst the Greek Cypriots. He had been the leader of the Greek Cypriots since the 1950s, when he was elected Archbishop of the Orthodox Church of Cyprus. Now, Spiros Kyprianou, a close associate of Archbishop Makarios from the days of the anti-colonial struggle. He was foreign minister for a while under Makarios, took over as president. The arrangement was that he would serve the remainder of the term of office of the late Archbishop Makarios, and then there would be elections. So, urged by the Secretary General, Kyprianou met with Denktash on the 18th and 19th of May 1979. The discussion led to the high-level agreement of 1979. This was, in a sense, an extension of the high-level agreement of between Makarios and Denktash of 1977. It just provided some more details as to how negotiations would proceed. It was agreed to resume the intercommunal talks on 15th June 1979. The basis for the talks would be the Makarios-Denktash guidelines of 12 February 1977 and the UN resolutions relevant to the Cyprus question. There should be respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms of all citizens of the Republic. The talks will deal with all territorial and constitutional aspects. Priority will be given to reaching agreement of the resettlement of Varosha under UN auspices, simultaneously with the beginning of the consideration by the interlocutors, the negotiators, that is, of the constitutional and territorial aspects of a comprehensive settlement. After agreement on Varosha has been reached, it will be implemented without awaiting the outcome of the discussion on other aspects of the Cyprus problem. Regarding this point, I would just like to point out that it is one of the very clear examples of how, on the Turkish side, you would have an agreement at one point over an issue which would later not be adopted, would not be implemented. And this was the case with Varosha. The agreement was there from 1979. Varosha is still a ghost town, hostage to Ankara, and being used in a way every now and then as a means to gain other advantages by saying, if this is agreed, we will return Varosha to its inhabitants. So it was also agreed to abstain from any action which might jeopardize the outcome of the talks, and special importance will be given to initial practical measures by both sides to promote goodwill, mutual confidence, and the return to normal conditions. This was paving the way for the adoption of confidence-building measures. It's a soft diplomacy. It was found that there were areas where there could be cooperation to start building better conditions between the two sides. The demilitarization of the Republic of Cyprus is envisaged, and matters relating thereto would be discussed. Now, this has been the subject of discussion in all future negotiations, but Turkey insists on two things. One, to maintain its rights as a guarantor power, and second, to maintain a military presence on the island. This obviously contradicts what is stated, but of course the Turkish side would say, yes, but we did not agree at the time to these, but agreed that they will be discussed. So the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity and non-alignment of the Republic should be adequately guaranteed against union in whole or in part with any other country and against any form of partition or secession. This was a principle that existed in the 1959 in the Zurich-London agreements, and it was aimed at saying that the Greek Cypriots would abandon the idea of enosis, and the Turkish Cypriots would abandon the idea of Taksim, partition, that is, uniting part of the island with Turkey. I must say that on the Greek Cypriot side, this idea of union with Greece in any case had been weakening over the years, and after 1974 the majority of the people realized that as much as it had been an ideal for decades, from a practical point of view, it is no longer possible. The intercommunal talks will be carried out in a continuing and sustained manner, avoiding any delay. the intercommunal talks will take place in Nicosia. Kyprianou repeatedly stated that he would follow the late Archbishop Makarios' policies regarding the solution of the Cyprus problem. On 15th November 1983, Tektash declared the creation of the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, TRNC. So far, this has been recognized only by Turkey. There followed a complicated series of meetings and negotiations, and UN Secretary General Perez de Aguilar did really try hard to bring the two sides closer together. One would see here that what the Turkish Cypriot leader Rauf Tektaş was trying, he was preempting any developments by declaring what he said would be the Turkish Cypriot federated state, but creating in the process fait accompli, and which would then be presented in any future negotiations as realities on the ground, as has always been described by the Turkish side. Turkish intransigence, however, did not allow progress in the negotiations. Ankara would not give in to any external pressure or UN resolutions, and there are a number of UN resolutions which have been ignored by Turkey, and no country was prepared to take part in any specific practical measures to make Ankara accept a compromise. This is not to say that at times, maybe on the Greek Cypriot side, there are things for which more, how shall I say, more flexible approach could be adopted, but there are basic principles that should govern any modern state that, in a sense, form the red lines that one would not easily accept that in the 21st century one would create a confederation with the characteristics that are described by the Turkish side, in which there is restriction of movement of the people of Cyprus. There is restriction in the sort of the return of refugees to their homes, restrictions on whether they would get back their property or not. So these are difficulties that cannot be easily resolved. Now, George Vasiliou won the presidential elections in February 1988, supported by Agel. Vasiliou did not belong to any political party. He was a businessman, a successful businessman, and he brought something new to the political life of Cyprus. He was not restrained or constrained by political considerations in terms of party politics and future elections and so on. And he really committed himself at sort of finding a solution to the Cyprus problem, to the extent that he did make certain concessions, some rather symbolic, but in that way indicating his readiness to follow a more conciliatory policy in order to reach an agreement. The UN Secretary General tried hard to convince Tektaş to pursue negotiations along the lines of the 1977 and 1979 high-level agreements. Tektaş adopted a negative attitude, raising new demands and moving away from the principles of the high-level agreements. In April 1992, the UN Secretary General, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, presented a revised set of ideas in an effort to get the negotiations restarted. Revised in the sense that there were already a set of ideas prepared by the previous Secretary General, and even before that. So it was a collection of previous, one might say, agreements which were put together in an effort to get, as we said, the negotiations restarted. Not much progress was made, substantial progress. There was progress in some of the more minor aspects of the problem, but not the substantial issues. So one would say the Cyprus problem continued, and in February 1993, Glavkos Kliridis won the presidential elections and now assumed responsibility for the intercommunal talks which began soon. Now, Glavkos Kliridis is generally considered an experienced politician. He had been leader of the DC party which he created. He had been a close associate of Archbishop Makarios before that. He had been involved even in the days of the anti-colonial struggle. He was seen as a moderate politician, realistic and flexible. And in these respects, there were high hopes that Kliridis would manage to bring about progress in the intercommunal talks. So again, there were intensive efforts by the UN Secretary General, Gali, the UN Security Council also exerting pressure, and at one time even President Clinton got involved, trying through American diplomacy to provide a kind of breakthrough from the deadlock that existed. But the intransigence of the Turkish government and the Turkish Cypriot leader Rauf Denktaş prevented any progress. One other thing that could be mentioned is the crisis relating to the missiles S-300, which the government of the Republic was to purchase and did purchase eventually from Russia. This created a tense situation in the area. Again, Turkey threatened that it would intervene militarily if the missiles arrived in Cyprus. This also worried the United States, it worried Britain, and in the end pressure was put. The missiles never arrived in Cyprus, and instead they were sent to Greece, and I think they are somewhere in Greece. I'm not aware whether they are operational or not, but the fact is that they did not come to Cyprus. Now, the new UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan, took over in January 1997. One would see succession of UN Secretary General, all trying over the years to promote a solution, but in spite of documents, in spite of sets of ideas and so on, so far not being successful. So there were renewed efforts at finding a solution. There was a meeting in the US, in Switzerland, in Nicosia, in but again with difficulties, talks, new ideas on the table, some progress at one point, but in the end, same result. Deadlock, no agreement. February 1998, Glafkos Clearidis was re-elected president. Glafkos Clearidis, as he was progressing through his second term, did not want to run for the presidency again. He was pressured to do so. Tassos Papadopoulos won the presidential elections in February 2003. Now, Glafkos Clearidis, an experienced politician, had been trying in his own way to bring about compromise on certain issues, working closely with UN Secretary General. However, in spite of all his efforts, it was not possible to arrive at a comprehensive solution. There were agreements on individual issues. Tassos Papadopoulos won the presidential elections in February 2003. Glafkos Clearidis was old. He was tired. He had been involved in Cyprus politics, one would say, for half a century and a bit more. And he did not want, as I said, to run again. He was, however, pressured to doing so. He presented his candidacy, but which he said he only wanted to serve for a short period of time to conclude negotiations and not a full term. Tassos Papadopoulos won the presidential elections in February 2003. Now, with Tassos Papadopoulos as president, some things were going to change. Tassos Papadopoulos was certainly a very competent politician, had also been involved extensively in the Cyprus issue from the days of the anti-colonial struggle, but also different from Clearidis in that he has been described by many as a hardliner. He had certain views as to what should constitute the basis of any solution to the Cyprus problem, and he was not prepared to move away from what he considered touched fundamental principles and fundamental rights of the people of Cyprus. In the meantime, in the background, it had already started with President Glafkos Clearidis. There was a plan being worked out. This came to be known as the Annan Plan. It went through various versions, 5 in actual fact, and with the final 5th one, there were 2 separate referenda organized, one amongst the Turkish Cypriots, one amongst the Greek Cypriots, to vote whether they accepted the Annan Plan. 64% of the Turkish Cypriots voted in favor of the plan. 76% of the Greek Cypriots voted against the plan. Now, a lot has been said about the rejection of the plan by the Greek Cypriots. It has been described as the most significant opportunity for a solution of the Cyprus problem, and has been described by its supporters as a lost opportunity. Tassos Papadopoulos was criticized for his policy and his overall attitude of not supporting the plan. However, one must have in mind that The Annan Plan is a huge and complex document, and it needs to be studied carefully before one takes a stand on the issue. Here I could offer some explanation, because there was a lot made out of the Annan Plan by governments all over the world, by the media all over the world, and also the with accusations of how the Greek Cypriots adopted a negative attitude and finally rejected it. It's early, historically speaking, to say in a definitive way, okay, this was a good plan, it could have worked, and it could have provided the solution to the Cyprus problem. However, I would just want to raise a number of issues that for consideration, and those who are particularly interested in this, the Annan Plan is available, it's an open document, they could look, and taking into consideration possibly a lot that I have said in these lectures about Cyprus and the Cyprus problem, reading other books, articles and so on, can form their own opinion. What I would want to say at this point is that the raw original documents probably amount to something like 10,000 pages. These were ideas and so on collected by UN officials and their administrators over the years, recording different agreements or different proposals and so on over the years. Now, this was finally condensed into a kind of document that amounted to something like 500 pages. This was sprung on to the people, asking them to vote yes or no. However, I want to point out 2 or 3 things. This was to take place on the referendum took place on the 24th of April. It was about 1 week before the Republic of Cyprus would join the European Union. The Annan Plan provided for what was in a sense a dissolution of the Republic of Cyprus in view of what was going to follow with the creation of the new state. I just put a question. How safe was this 1 week before accession to be accepted? How would Turkey behave? Of course, one would take it on, or some say on trust, that this was agreed by the Turkish side and that they would implement it. I would only refer back to all the sort of even limited agreements that were reached over the previous 30 years and see how many of those were adopted by the Turkish side. The rejection of the Annan Plan by the majority of the Greek Cypriots, vast majority, 76%, put the Greek side again on the spot. There are other aspects of the Annan Plan that one could mention. Some were positive, others created, to say the least, apprehension. For example, not all the refugees would return to their homes. There were restrictions as to how many and where they could return. There was nobody to guarantee that the measures, provisions, the main provisions would be implemented. No country volunteered to guarantee this. For example, it provided for gradual demilitarization, the withdrawal of Turkish troops from Cyprus. Who would guarantee this? Anyway, there were apprehensions. There were those that were emotionally, let's say, against it, without detailed analysis of the provisions, but also there were those who were very strongly in favor, without again considering some of the details and so on, but rather that this was an opportunity for a solution of the Cyprus problem. So much for the Annan Plan. It was certainly, and it is, a very important document in the course of the Cyprus problem. Those who are interested, as I said, can look at it and choose parts to read and form their own opinion. February 2008, Dimitris Christofias, General Secretary of the Communist Party AGEL, won the presidential elections. Christofias was committed to finding a viable, just and lasting solution to the Cyprus problem. Negotiations began between Christofias and the Turkish Cypriot leader Mehmet Ali Talat. Mehmet Ali Talat was considered a moderate politician, and there were hopes that progress would be achieved. Certainly, Dimitris Christofias, from his background, the party he belonged to, had always advocated close relations with the Turkish Cypriots, and really an ardent supporter of a solution through certain compromises. Now, in the process of the talks, negotiations, there was progress and agreement on a number of issues between the two leaders, which raised hopes that these two leaders were on the right track of leading Cyprus to better days, to a solution of the Cyprus problem. However, no final solution was reached, although, as I said, there were agreements on separate issues, as overall Ankara continued its intransigent policy. And when they were not satisfied with Mehmet Ali Talat, they actually used the influence, control they had in the occupied areas to support right-wing Turkish Cypriot Dervish Eroglu, who was their choice, and Talat lost the elections. Once more now, negotiations became difficult. Dervish Eroglu was more under the influence and control of Ankara, and would not, on his own initiative, reach a compromise. This is another aspect of this sort of Cyprus problem and the reasons for not finding a solution, that on both sides, the Greek Cypriot side and the Turkish Cypriot side, change of leadership could mean that some of the things that were agreed would not be followed, or certainly a different approach would be adopted. In some cases this was good, in some cases it was negative, because it was taking issues back to what they might have been 5, 10, 15 years earlier. Nikos Anastasiadis was elected president in February 2013. He was a supporter of the Annan Plan and keen to find a solution. Dimitris Christofias was very disappointed that he had not been able to find a solution. He did try very hard, and so did Mehmet Ali Talat. But issues beyond their control prevented a solution. President Anastasiadis, as I said, a supporter of the Annan plan, keen to find a solution, at first had to negotiate with the Turkish Cypriot leader Derviş Eroglu, and then from April 2015 with Mustafa Akinci, who took over as the leader, president in inverted commas of the TRNC, as a leader of the Turkish Cypriots. Now, Mustafa Akinci is a moderate politician. He has a record of moderation, a record of favoring conciliation and finding a solution. However, his freedom of action is considerably restricted by the Turkish government. Even lately, Ankara had managed to sort of place in position Turkish Cypriot politicians that reflect more the views of the Turkish government than those of Mustafa Akinci, and this has made his position even more difficult. The climax of these negotiations between Mustafa Akinci and Nikos Anastasiadis was reached in July 2017 at a high-level meeting at Grand Montana. It was a high-level meeting held under the auspices and direct involvement of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The participants in this meeting show its significance and how why it is considered a sort of high-level meeting. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, participated in person at some point, not right from the beginning, but then he was there. Nikos Anastasiadis representing the Greek Cypriot side, Mustafa Akinci representing the Turkish Cypriot side, Nikos Kochas, the Greek Foreign Minister, Mevlut Cavusoglu, Turkish Foreign Minister, Sir Alan Duncan, UK Minister of State for Europe and the Americas, European Union representative in attendance. The European Union was given observer status. Federica Mogherini, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. There were high hopes for a solution. Basically, a reminder of the days just before the referenda for the Annan plan. There was again high expectation that, okay, such a high-level meeting would produce good results. It ended in failure again. The two sides, Greeks and Turks, blamed each other for the failure. There are details which we don't know yet fully. And it's not easy to say, okay, this side is fully to blame and the other side has no share of the blame at all. There are certain general points that could be made. One is that Turkey adopted again an intransigent attitude on basic issues like demilitarization, like no outside guarantees of any solution, and therefore no intervention rights. On the Greek side, there was insisted on some of the basic principles regarding human rights and so on, which the Turkish side would not accept because it would affect the territory of what they wanted as the sort of Turkish Cypriot federated state, the issue of the settlers. And it's also evident that there is the presence of all these important political figures representing the different countries, but they were there in a way trying to facilitate negotiations and in no way taking very strong stand on certain issues if these were clearly in violation of internationally accepted principles regarding justice, human rights, democracy, etc. What is the situation in 2020? The issue of the hydrocarbons has made the problem more complicated. Turkey violated the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus and is threatening with further unilateral actions, accusing the Greek Cypriots of trying to exploit this wealth that would result for their benefit and ignoring the rights of the Turkish Cypriots. The Greek Cypriot side offers guarantees as to a fair share of these proceeds from any exploitation of natural gas and so on after a solution. And this has made matters even more complicated. And in this prevailing tense atmosphere, no negotiations are currently taking place. What is the future? Some concluding remarks. The future is certainly uncertain. The UN is still involved, and the United Nations force in Cyprus continues its presence on the island. It's renewed periodically every year, twice a year in actual fact, and it continues its presence, but one doesn't know for how long this would last. Looking back, one would say that the Cyprus problem has gone through different phases. There is the first phase, more or less beginning with the 1950s, certainly started after the Second World War, where the demand by the Greek Cypriots for union with Greece began to intensify, to increase, and then there was the EOKA struggle, the anti-colonial struggle for enosis, which resulted in the creation of the Republic of Cyprus. And it appeared that it had ended that phase of the problem because during those years there was conflict between the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. There was a threat of a serious conflict between Greece and Turkey. Then came the period of 1960-1963, where there were internal tensions in trying to make this new state with the constitution it had to function and function effectively. This led to disagreements. There were still on both sides those who dreamed of partition and union of part of the island with Turkey, and on the Greek side, those who considered that Cyprus was Greek and therefore it should be united with Greece. December 1963, we have the intercommunal conflict. In actual fact, it was armed conflict, and this led us to a new phase of the Cyprus problem, 1964 with the new realities. The Turkish Cypriots had withdrawn from government and so on. They were in the enclaves. The green line that was drawn up separated the two sides, not in the way that they have been separated since 1974, but still not working together in the administration of the island, in the government of the island. And then 64 to 74, we said there is this tension, trying to find a solution based on the situation that existed in those years. Tragic events of 74, the coup, then followed by the Turkish invasion, which created a new situation on the island. And since 1974, all these attempts at a solution of the Cyprus problem that I have tried to outline, because going into detail would involve much more time, and it also becomes very complicated to follow all the stages through which negotiations took place. Concluding, we could say that on certain occasions, like with the Gallo Plaza report, with Gali, the set of ideas, UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, the Annan plan, certainly, there appear to be light at the end of the tunnel. But this elusive and elusive settlement finds a way each time to move further away, and the Cyprus problem still remains unsolved. These are the actors. You see on the screen Cyprus as it is now, Cyprus as a member of the European Union, the UN and its role, the flag of the illegal Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, the flag of Turkey, and the flag of Greece, all participants in this complicated issue that has affected the people of Cyprus over all these years. This is all that I had to say. I have come to the end of this survey, trying to give an overall picture in broad outline of the modern history of Cyprus. Thank you.